Okay, welcome back to Aimless Ramblings. This is our second podcast, and I was the one that had to bring up the topic. I'm Simon from the last one. We've got Tim and Sam also here to discuss things. So my question to the group was something along the lines of, does quantifying something, so giving something a numerical value, give it value? So I've been told that I have to be the first one off the blocks, so this is my take on it. I'm gonna actually, because I'm, like to be counter-narrative, I'm the hipster of the group, I'm gonna actually be kind of discussing how it's somewhat, value doesn't come from a quantifiable source, but the other Sam and Tim will be discussing it from the other perspective. So, to begin with, I'm just going to discuss how the modern movement for a lot of people has been away from like a materialistic sort of, I need to buy 27 plates to justify my existence and gain value, towards like this sort of more experience focused. So there's a study that I'll put it at the end of this podcast, which discusses how value in and of itself of individuals has moved away from like, there's a lot of money in actually experiences in the modern day and age. So simply by not purchasing, well, there's this whole time movement away from buying houses because they've become more expensive, from buying, collector's items like plates, dolls and whatnot. And a lot more into going overseas, going to places and whatnot. And the market's actually really caught up with that. So the newest thing on the block is noticing that from a financial standpoint, people are more likely to spend more because it's a unique experience rather than because it's a unique item. So they're like, oh, wow, it's very rare that I'll be able to go to the Great Wall of China. So I'm going to spend more money than I'm comfortable spending to do that because it's a unique experience. I feel like I've ate through a lot of my content already, but the other one that I found while looking up bits about experience was actually how the market places value. So as I previously explained in previous generations, value came from owning things. So if you owned like, a wicker chair, you're like, this is a pretty neat wicker chair. This is mine. And I am the best person on my block because I own a TV. I own a wicker chair. I know all these things. However, people value that differently. So the best, and this is another thing I'm going to bring forward. I know it sounds like I've done a lot of really high-end research, but this one I actually got from a YouTube video by, what's the thing called? Adam Ruins Anything. And he brought up the fact that there's a lot of dead weight when it comes to Christmas presents and presents in general, because what I value and what you value are slightly different. And then it comes up as an economic thing when I go, okay, well, I'd be willing to pay $100 for this thing because I think it's really cool. But that's from my standpoint. And I give someone a gift that oh, well, this might be good as a sleep shirt. So I'd pay maybe $15 for it. That's like a deficit of $75, and that happens every Christmas. So value doesn't come from a quantifiable source, be that financial or be that sort of numerical numbers of things. It just comes from this social construct of, this is how much I care about the item, and this is how much I would pay for the item. But yeah, so in the case of trips, it gets a bit over it. Okay, yeah, Sam. Tim, what do you got?
So I'd say, Simon, thanks for cracking us off. I always know it's hard to start. One of the things I would go with is, so you're saying that we're seeing more of a commodification of experience and how experiential value is now being weighted more heavily in the current generation of tangible assets.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, there's still kind of a numeracy involved in that, in the sense that the number of trips you've taken and the direct proportion of the numerical value of the number of people that are able to go visit that locale actually leads to a sort of a disproportionate relationship with the value of the asset? So for instance, if there is an island which only 10 people can visit, and you're one of those 10 people that go to visit it, and then it's declared a national heritage, no one's allowed to go there ever again. That's like a massive tick in terms of quantifiable value. But then if everybody's allowed to go there, yeah.
So you mean like sort of in the horrible... Oh, yep, Sam?
Go first.
Oh, yeah. So what you actually said is very interesting. It's actually very current in the respects that Uluru suffering from a lot of tourists just sort of flooding there because they're banning it, I think, is it mid this month? That nobody else can do that. However, it's actually really interesting to see where they increased the prices and where people were willing to spend more weren't specifically these secluded islands. They weren't really a limited resource. They were just sort of this... I guess social currency from the fact that I went overseas. So there's a lot of people that would go, oh yeah, I want to go to this very secluded place, but most people just want to go to another hotel where they can buy McDonald's in a different country and say they went to another country, and that's what they like. Yep, Tim.
So yeah, I was going to say that on top of that, so it's still sort of keeping up with the Joneses. Like that hasn't really changed. It's just that now. It's about the holiday. It's about look at the things that I've done with my life. Look at the kinds of people I am. Like, I've run a marathon. You haven't run a marathon, you piece of shit. Like, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Sam?
First of all, I think you're both reasonably cynical with this. I think maybe people are just doing it because it's something they're enjoying, not necessarily, trying to just keep up with the Joneses and all that jazz. It's also provide us a quantitative value, Tim. You say it's 1 out of 10 people on the island is a quantitative value, but it's not. It's a qualitative experience. I mean, maybe if we had enough data, you could provide a quantitative value to it, but we definitely don't in the situation we operate. It's all qualitative.
So, so from my standpoint, I can understand how you would perceive what I was saying as cynical, but the sort of way I was looking at it was more along the lines that it's less of we want a limited amount of something. It's more that we want the experience and that it's actually a financially viable outcome. That was more what I was going with they're paying more for the same sort of experience. It's that this isn't just like oh wow, I like to go for a putt down the park. It's also replacing a lot of financial things. So for example, tourist towns and whatnot, that's the kind of standpoint I was coming from, was that these experiences are just part of the life experience. This is almost like a replacement of just buying objects, in the respect that there's still a financial viability to it. Tim, how are you going to respond to the quantitative qualitative argument?
Well, first of all, I'd say 100% I'm very cynical. So
a good way to be.
That's a fair cop. But I would say that in terms of the actual numeracy of the value, I think in some ways it's very relativistic because of its intangible nature. What it means is, I suppose in my mind, I'm saying is that although it is hard to actually directly quantify the value of the experience on the basis of, well, with the exception of maybe tallying the total cost of traveling to the location, I think that one way that you can sort of in a second order effect, in the same way in particle physics, where you might not necessarily be able to see an elementary particle, but you can measure the impact that particle has on its environs, and that's how you can detect its presence. With a trip to a holiday island or a holiday destination, in the same way as supply and demand, the willingness of people to pay money to go visit that island is a rough measure by which you can tell the intangible value of the experience of the island. Same as you could also argue that total tourist flows, etc., would be another good one. And the way that there's a sort of relationship between, it's a lot cheaper to go to tourist destinations that are more popular, and I suppose the immediate comeback, which I'm already sensing, is that that's because the infrastructure there is easier to handle it. But I think there is definitely potentially a relationship that could be teased out between the cost of going to a place versus the number of people that start going there and how it's perceived in terms of as a hot or a not sort of location.
That's very interesting,
Sam?
Tim, but I think Sam's got to come back, yeah.
So, like, you say the value people are willing to pay is a metric of the quality, the quantitative value of the trip. So say I go to Hawaii, right, and I fork out $20,000 to go there. I land, I've been on the island for 10 minutes, and then I get robbed. And then I get hit by a car, and then there's a monsoon and a volcano or something, right? Shit experience. Really low value for me. I spent a lot of money on it. So just because I spent a large sum of money doesn't mean my experience is going to match that quantitative value, because the experience is the qualitative.
I think that... sorry, you go
Simon.
first, Simon.
Which I actually found interesting, Lee, feeds back into my Christmas present idea. That's like, you can't physically put a price on the experience because it means a different thing to different people. However, as much as I'd like to discuss my element, I feel like we need to actually move on to Tim's element of this discussion, if that's all right with everybody. But Tim, yeah?
I actually think it joins quite nicely with this one because I'm talking about intangible versus tangible assets and value. And in particular, I'm talking about that from the perspective of organizations. So one of the biggest factors that can determine an organization's ability to perform in the long run is morale, right? Morale is a very much an intangible factor, and it's very difficult to measure. There's quite a few, there's a few different articles. I'll give a link to one with regards to from a sort of a organizational business side, practice side of house from Forbes, but there's also another one which is a book called Courage Under Fire, which talks about morale in terms of military organizations and their ability to operate in a warlike context and how morale impacts their ability to fight and win. And so what I would say is that much like the issue of the intangible value of the experience, I think that we're talking about the whole sort of the whole discussion we're having here is centered around the idea that something's quantifiability is what necessarily gives it value. And I think that although there is many intangible things, such as the quality of an experience, and in some cases also very relativistic things, like, for instance, I might really like a truffle hot dog with jalapeno slices on it, but Simon might hate that. There's sort of the mixture of intangibility but also relativity in some of these values that you can still, by a second order effect, measure some of these things. And once again, it's sort of like rough slicing. Like you're not going to get a good fine-grained understanding of the object, but something like, for instance, in the visit schedule, like some people are going to have a bad time, some people are going to have a good time. But if you rough out the sample size enough, you can sort of get a rough estimate, although once again with caveats, as to the qualitative value of the holiday. With regards to morale, another intangible value asset, you can look at the success of the organization over time, and then also potentially, whether you're doing exit interviews of people who are leaving the organization, or even periodical appraisal and dialogues between management and staff, you can sort of take a pretty subjective barometer test, but over time you can use that as a mechanism by which to measure these intangible and unquantifiable assets and how they impact on society more broadly or an organization specific example. Sam, did you have something you want to say there?
Not terribly. I noticed you switched to qualitative rather than quantitative when talking about your holiday, so I think I may have won that point. Simon?
What I found quite interesting was how you were discussing that, like, food was a good example of this barometer. However, like, in some ways I feel like the quality of a food item can actually be a negatively geared towards individuals. Like, some people that are from a particular socioeconomic area will actually see that as, like, the enemy's kind of food. The same with how you were discussing, like, I might not like the same hot dogs as you. It doesn't mean that that's valued any differently. It just means that, like, my taste buds are at a different point. So, for example, I'm not going to buy sugar flakes because sugar flakes aren't really a good up in the morning kind of thing for me. Another really interesting thing you mentioned was how a quantifiable thing would be when they leave the organization. That's a really good thing. Half my job is actually, well, my job, inverted commas, half of my job, I pretend that I have a job, which is being a student, is writing up. Yes, yeah. The government thinks so I'm gonna run with it. Like, most of the data we get is pretty for the multi-choice element, which would be where you would most of where we get our like feedback and where our teachers get their feedback is actually from you put your own little input and they force you to put your own input in there. So that's like the most qualitative way to measure anything. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, like,
the only thing
it's usually
I would
a balance.
say, yeah, the only thing I would say is that I definitely think that one of the issues with intangible assets is that, or intangible values or intangible objects, is that they're really hard to rank because of their subjective nature. Like, for instance, if the economy collapses tomorrow, something of intangible value right now because it is artistically in and has been produced by the most hip artist right now, even though it's a physical object. Yeah, exactly. Even though it's a tangible object, its intangible value immediately collapses because it's no longer relevant in the societal circumstance that it's been put into. Sam?
As my lovely economist wife would say, things are worth what someone will pay for them. You know,
Yeah.
If the frame of reference for the value of an object changes, so does its value.
Well, I think that actually might be a good transition point, Simon.
Oh, a good transition point to what Sam has to say?
Mm-hmm.
Sam?
Sure. I was going to talk about negative externalities. And I had a bit of a thing I was going to talk about in my head. But in the shops this morning, we were talking about how hard it is not to buy junk food. So you're in the shops, and it's like ideally positioned, you know, because obviously they make profit from you buying junk food. However, so it has, you know, a value, say $1 for a packet of chips. That's its quantitative value. However, it like has a much broader impact as a society. So, say I eat too much of this, I do, and I'm, you know, gaining some stuff around the midriff. That's going to have a societal impact, yeah. So it costs society more than the dollar I pay. So you've got this negative externalities. Climate change is a classic one. So what is the true ability for the current economic system to reflect value if not all positive and negative externalities are actually accounted into this price? You know, so climate change, your petrol in your car has a huge impact in that, but it's actually still comparatively cheap, cheaper than milk. So is the values we provide on things actually anything more than a number we've pulled out of our ass based on the amount of hypothetical currency units that someone is willing to exchange them for? I don't know. Brand.
Okay. Yeah, that, you know, on a much smaller and less important level, the newest release for Magic the Gathering has specifically tailored itself towards these buyers called, inverted commas, whales, which buy things to collect and gain value from them, and they like make ridiculously priced packs that no person could truly afford unless they're just wanting it for the collector's value and get your monies back. And it's this whole entire thing, as you discussed, like, you're not going to get your monies back from that item. It's only going to have the value that you buy it for yourself. Because since it's out of the box, it loses almost half its value, because most of its value is the fact that it is the box. Yeah, obviously, more importantly, there's the climate change kind of argument. However, I feel like
Magic the Gathering, what is climate change?
I was trying to make it a bit more of a closed system discussion, because climate change is just, there's so many different things to like try and discuss, because like you got to then bring in like the ability of particular areas to actually even do that. Like people go, oh well, the poorest countries must be the ones that are giving the most, but there's like, I think I was reading there's like a Tibetan country that's one of the smallest countries, and it's actually not carbon neutral. It's actually carbon, is it negative? They physically take in more carbon than they actually can produce, and there's just this weird concept of like, and then like how do you, obviously there's the CO2 is the basic measure of how do we affect greenhouse gases, but then it's like, how exactly do you put this as a thing in front of people and go, this is how much this is going to impact? Like, you can go, it's going to increase the temperature by this, but it's like, there's not that visual concept of, oh, this is catching things on fire kind of level. But
one thing I would say, sorry to dive in there, and I'm really trying hard to find the reference for it right now, but I'll try and put it in the description after this video, is that there's this idea which is banded around when they're talking about like the philosophy of epistemology. It's a rather new concept, the idea of a meta object, and they talk about climate change in this perspective because climate change is a meta object in that its actual ability to be sort of cognized by an individual is difficult because of the scale, both in terms of its size, but also its temporal scale. For people that are going through the first couple of decades of climate change, because it's something that hasn't occurred acutely, it's very difficult for them to ascribe value to it in the sense that, long-term potential species-threatening change to the environs that we're in, as opposed to the immediate economic impact on themselves to make changes in their current lifestyle and habits. So really, in terms of value, this is once again bringing it back to that intangible value and that sort of neuroeconomics that goes on. We're really hardwired to focus on the right now. Yes, Simon?
The best example when you were discussing how it's like this meta issue that nobody can understand is, it was really cold last winter, so therefore climate change is a lie kind of concept. That whole entire concept that, it's cold now, so therefore it can't be getting warmer. But definitely.
On the flip side, it's 40 degrees today. Oh my god, climate change. Or, it could just be 40 degrees.
And I would definitely say that, as a species, and I suppose probably animals more broadly, are hardwired to deal with what I would call the closest crocodile to the boat effect. So you're really worried about the right here, right now, what is going to impact my life in the next 24 hours, sort of closer. And so people are more worried about their day-to-day paycheck. They're more worried about, what's the house I live in like right now? What's the neighborhood that I live in right now? Rather than thinking like, oh, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down in the future, we're going to be in a society we can't really sustain. Sam?
You say that, but just the other weekend, there was a couple of million people across the planet protesting this, and Brisbane, local city for me, every weekend has had people protesting. So quite clearly we have the ability to cognate this issue. It could just be people are being lazy, or they haven't properly considered the negative externalities. Tim, I can see you're chomping at the bit.
No. So I would agree with you. What I think I'm trying to explain is kind of like the societal inertia that we've seen up until this point, particularly over the past couple of decades, that has led to now the movement we've seen it going forward. And what I would argue is that potentially the way people are voting and the way people are protesting right now might not necessarily have to do with a neuroeconomics calculus of cost versus benefit, and it's more to do with ideology and in-group, out-group markers. So if climate change has been identified with being in a particular political group, then obviously it's a much more pressing matter for you because you want to be part of that in-group. Simon?
As long as I'd like to talk about politics and climate change, if we could just dial it back to quantitative value, I feel like we could do a whole entire 2-hour-long discussion on just climate change and how it's politically, socially, like all that kind of stuff. But in relation, I feel like all three of us sort of took one side of it. So if we could just like in this discussion section, sort of like discuss this devil's advocate side of it, like how is okay? Yeah, Sam.
So, scientist by trade, right? So, the whole like concept of my occupation is that everything can be given a value. There is nothing that can't be quantitated. If you can't quantitate something, it just means you have insufficient data. So, like everything has a value. It can be ascribed a value. You can put it in the big ledger book of, to touch on climate change again, just to annoy you, like that gram of carbon dioxide you release has a value. We may not know its exact value, but it doesn't not have it. Everything has a quantitative value. It's just fucking iffy to find it.
Yeah, Tim?
Yeah, so I would say coming back to this aspect of quantifiability and value, I kind of agree in principle with Sam, in the sense that everything is quantifiable, and if we were to get to a stage of neurobiology and neuroscience where we actually understood human mind in such a manner that we could quantify human thought, so we understand purely from the neurochemistry what that person is thinking. Once again, that is showing my materialist biases there. I think that there is a plausible level of quantifiability for everything, but realistically, that's the difference between science and art. Art is dealing with to be fair, science has to deal with incomplete data all the time as well, but it's about the heuristics of reading incomplete data sets. Yeah. So yeah, it's the heuristics of reading incomplete data sets. So really, that's where the value issue is in this question, I think. Like, when you don't have a quantifiable value, it's about how do you interpret that value from other quantifiable data sets. Simon?
Yeah, like most of my stats courses as a pseudoscience is battling to be able to quantify something. Like, it's great when people will go, oh yeah, well, I'm doing mathematics, so I have it much easier than you. I'm like, I have to create a scale to measure the thing I want to measure. I have to go through so many loopholes to be able to make this intangible concept into something that I can test across the board to see if there's any impact. And I still love that there was like this argument between two different psychological scientists, where they built this whole entire argument and they got into like 20 papers, and then this third scientist came in and went, oh, your measures are completely made up. They don't actually have any factual bias. So it got rid of like 20 papers out of literature because the thing they were building on was like sand, so it had like no basis anymore because they were arguing on like this. Yeah, Tim, what did you say?
Yeah, so I would say that you've really touched on the crux of the matter, which is how difficult it is to build a model by which to understand stuff when you don't have a hard set of data to build off. One of the things I deal with doing analytic work day in, day out is like, is the thing that I'm reading actually related to anything? Is this piece of information actually causally, logically linked to an outcome? And that really is the hard part, I suppose, of the soft sciences.
Especially what I found is you'll find a really good correlation between two things, but you've got to work out whether it's at all important or like anybody really cares. Like, for all I can go, it's like, it's really important that we found out that question 5 and question 6 were very highly correlated. And you're like, does that mean anything? They're like, no, we just used like a similar terminology, and it was another effect that nobody gives a crap about. So yeah.
Or do we just not have enough data to determine what the effect is? It could be it's mind-shatteringly relevant, but we just are missing one critical piece.
Well, it's more that it's relevant to another field.
Mm.
And, everybody's self-interest when they got their own field in mind.
No, definitely.
Well, having a look at the time, that might be all that we have time for. Simon, thank you very much for coming up with a question.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Good, some nice rants.
All right, and thank you very much to our audience. We'll catch you next time.